Hi, kids. It's Raz. All right. This is going to be our presentation on generally biological population. So, it covers 3.1 all the way through 3.5. I may have to chunk this into two. We'll see how it goes. First thing, I think, kind of obviously, population size is how many populations there are in an area at a given time. We will talk about in class several different sampling techniques we can use. One of the most common is the Lincoln Index, which is what we'll do in class. It's kind of like a mark recapture sort of thing. That was lack of a better word. But we'll talk through that in class. And no, there's lots of other ways we can do that. The other thing that we want to look at is population density. And I think you know what density means, right? So population density is just how many living things there are in a given area and how crowded that is. So how dense they are. There's pros and cons to both, right? Low population densities are going to give more space to those living things. You're going to have more resources available, but finding mates or the protection that comes with kind of a herd are lacking. And higher population densities, we get obviously the protection, easier to find mates, but there's usually more competition. It's got cut off a little bit, but more competition over resources and things like that. The other thing we're going to look at is how populations are distributed. So we have three types of population distribution. First one's random, second's uniform, and the last is clumped. So random is when, kind of just like it sounds, organisms are arranged in no particular pattern. We often see things that reproduce by seed, particularly ones that are carried on like wind or water or by living things in this format. Think like a dandelion, right? If you take the dandelion and you blow on it and those little white puffy things go everywhere, those are going to randomly land and randomly grow. Okay. Uniform distribution, we see in a couple different ways. This is when living things are evenly spaced. So obviously when we plant orchards or crops, we have uniform distribution, right? We purposely plant them in a specific way. But there's also in nature, sometimes living things that will produce toxins or things that make it so that other things don't go around it. And they kind of limit that to, or they produce those toxins for a specific area. That's going to create uniform distribution. Most commonly, we see clumped distribution, where organisms are kind of grouped around resources. I think of human population throughout time. We typically find, well, in any populations, around water sources because we need water. We clump around those resources. And those different population distributions are going to determine or affect how those living things interact in those areas. Okay, so let's talk about population change a little bit. I'm going to skip over this slide. We'll talk later. When we look at populations, there's a couple things we look at. We look at first immigration and emigration. So just a reminder, immigration is living things coming into an area. Emigration is living things going out. Okay, so immigration, emigration. And typically when we use these terms, we're talking like long term. Things are moving into an area and staying there. We're not talking migration per se, but migration will also impact population size. Okay. The other things we look at are birth and death rates, right? And this slide is terribly not formatted well, but that's okay. So when we look at a population, we have to take into account birth rate and immigration. That's what's causing it to increase. And then subtract it from death rate and emigration, which are the things that are lowering that population. The number you get is the population growth rate. If it's a positive number, that means population is growing. Bigger numbers, growing faster, right? Negative numbers are shrinking, and the bigger the negative number, the faster it's shrinking. Now, we usually will express all of these in terms of individuals per 1,000. So we're not talking total population. We're talking like as a ratio, as a percentage. Okay. Now, when we look at that population growth, we're typically going to see two different things. One of the types of growth we might see is exponential. Now, this should be a review from bio, right? This is when a population starts to kind of increase relatively slowly, but then takes off, and you get that J-shaped curve. This usually doesn't last too long, and it usually only happens when we have like ideal environmental conditions. There's no limiting factors. Living things aren't really competing over stuff. It's like this utopia. More realistically, we see what's called logistic growth. Okay, and logistic growth is the idea that we'll have that initial and exponential growth, but then growth is going to level off. And it's going to level off because there are things that are limiting that population size. We call those limiting factors. Okay, there's two types of them. density dependent and density independent. So density dependent limiting factors are going to be things that are going to change as the population becomes more dense. Those are going to be things like competition, disease, lack of resources, things like that, okay, are going to be density dependent. Density independent are things that are going to impact it no matter what. They're almost always natural disaster type things, right? A hurricane, a tornado that comes through. Those are going to affect that population the same amount, whether they're densely populated or not. Either way, all of those limiting factors kind of cap that population growth. Where that population levels off is what we call the carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity is just the amount of species of one specific species that an ecosystem can support. And carrying capacity can be different, right? The carrying capacity for, say, rabbits is going to be very different than the carrying capacity for, say, a wolf, okay? But there is that carrying capacity. So this is, again, kind of showing you this. Now, we usually show this graph over here or get that nice little logistic growth. Usually, though, it doesn't just like straight off level off. Usually what we see happen is more like what's in the second graph. We get an initial overshoot, right? Living things are reproducing like crazy. They go way over. When they go way over, there's either a lack of resource or too much competition or something. We'll have a die off. That initial die off will drop us below carrying capacity and starts to kind of come back up again. And you end up sort of getting this wave around carrying capacity. That's more realistically what happens. Okay, so obviously skipping this one, we're going to do that in class. Skip this one. So here's an FRQ if you want to practice along with this one, is looking at a canine virus and looking at how that canine virus impacted the moose population. So there's some questions there. I'll let you fiddle with that. Come back.